Hey, have you seen this Bible? It's ginormous. It's ginormous.
What? Why did you give him three hands? Welcome to another episode of Catholic Piety on Purpose. I'm your host, Rich Van Kunit, and today we are going to start talking about the Catholic Bible, this ginormous, huge beast of a Bible. Once again, this is a study Bible, right? So it's really big because of all the commentary, but in general, you can get thin-line Bibles, you can get all sorts of Bibles that aren't going to be that big. But from a technical perspective, there is a difference between the Bible that I used as a Protestant and the Bible that I now use as a Catholic. In fact, there is 7-book difference. So in the Protestant world, I was used to having a 66-book Bible, and in Catholic churches, we have a 73-book Bible. So 46 in the old, 27 in the new. So my arguments always were given to me that the Catholics added books of the Bible, and they did this to somehow prove or make new doctrines that weren't in the Bible. So they added Bible books, and now they can come up with new things that weren't really supposed to be in the Bible. But historically speaking, this is obviously mathematically incorrect, right? How can you add books to someone who comes after you, right? So if the Reformation happens in 1517, how can Catholics add Bibles to something that existed before 1517? And that's like the first thing that we really need to talk about, right? So it was like, when did the Bible get compiled? And so life happened, right? And the apostles wrote down the Gospels, Paul's missionary letters, the epistles. John would have his apocalypse that he would write. And these are times when, there's not a printing press, there isn't email, there's nothing to really get these things everywhere. And that's why you have what we call tradition, right? It's like, but the apostolic deposit of faith was given, and that is what is being preached and taught as all of the churches start to be established throughout the world, as in the book of Acts, the gospel starts to spread. And so, like everything in history, when it comes to the church, things that were considered solid start to get tested by heresy. So all of a sudden, people start to come up and say, oh, I have this gospel of Thomas or something that you've never seen before, and I knew so-and-so, and so now we have this other gospel to add, and it it has like 1 or 2 geography places where, like the book of Matthew's is just like, they're traveling everywhere. They know names, they know all these things, right? So not to go into, how, it was kind of obvious that these were heretical texts, you would have enough things coming at the church where you would have to have a council and then establish dogmatically or, what the church teaches and what we know of, right? So the canon of the Bible was first solidified in 382 at the Council of Rome. And so that was under Pope Damascus I. And then once again in 393 at the Councils of Hippo and of Carthage, which happened in 397 and 419, it also affirmed the same 73-book list, right? And so these were North African councils heavily influenced by St. Augustine. And then finally, in 1546, that's when you had the Council of Trent, and that's when, the church formally and infallibly defined the 73-book canon as dogma because of what happened with the Reformation and how actually those 7 books were removed from what was codified, let's say in 382, onwards, right? So why? There's a lot of reasons why, and I don't want to build straw mans as to why those books were removed or why they were put in the first place. So let me just give you some things that we could at least say, okay, I get where both are kind of coming from, right? So the Catholic Church, when they looked at the Old Testament, they went with what was called the Septuagint, right? And what this was the Hebrew canon, the Jewish canon that was created around the 3rd or 2nd century BC, right, by Greek-speaking Jews. So they're like, everybody's speaking Greek. Everything was originally in Hebrew. We will translate that Hebrew into the Greek, and this is the canon, the books of the Old Testament that at that time of Jesus was being used. And so because the early church was predominantly Greek-speaking, that larger canon became the norm, right? It's like, what canon was around when Jesus was teaching? Let's use that. So what the Protestants did was that they would turn to what's called the Masoretic text. And the Masoretic text was standardized and written in Hebrew and maintained by the Jewish rabbis from the 7th to 10th centuries AD. And so I could see where this was a kind of like a noble thing that they're thinking through, if this is the one sole reason, which is not. But it's like, hey, we want to get back to the originals. Let's look and find that text that was written in Hebrew and start translating that. And let's go back to the source, right? Because now we are growing this whole, Bible alone doctrine and way of viewing things. The problem with that is that this is now a canon that is being put together in a post-Christ Jewish world. And so the temple's been destroyed. The Messiah has came. They have rejected that Messiah. And so now they're compiling this world that they're going to now live in that rejects Christ and has this Hebrew way of living from here on out. Talmud would come further, I believe, down the road, things like that. And so, the Christians, Catholics at that time, loved these books, these 7 books. And so I don't know if that was the problem with it, just because Christians liked it, or if there was things in there that pointed to the Messiah. But that's when this happened. This happened at a time in history where they were reforming themselves after the aftermath of Christ's death and resurrection and how Christianity is spreading throughout the world, right? So Catholics refer to those 7 as deuterocanonical, right? Second canon of books, while Protestants will call them apocryphal, which just means hidden and uninspired. And so we got like Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, Burach, and sometimes there'll be extra portions of Esther's and Daniel, right? So I should say, like, even the Orthodox, they put a little extra things in there as well. That kind of, the way it's separated and put together can be more than 73, okay? Now, this wasn't without debate or conflict, right? So Pope Damascus tells Jerome, we need to now compile the books and get everything into Latin. And, he's like, I don't know about these 7, right? Because he's hanging out with all these Hebrews trying to learn Hebrew. And he's noticing that those aren't in the 7 books. And so at the end of the day, the church speaks, they have the council, and Jerome submits to the Pope and to the church, and he makes the Latin Vulgate, and that has, the 73 books. So, and I think that's really important from a Catholic perspective, right? Because you could say the argument would be, see, people had a problem with this, so, it was never like universally, no problem with it, and we're the first ones to have a problem with it. But there's also this other side that says they submitted to the church in those times, and that's what, the Holy Spirit was given to, the apostles handed down, made disciples. We got the office of the keys going on. You have this council of believers coming together, and that is the decision. And so Jerome submits to the church and says, okay, we'll put them all in there, right? St. Augustine, others, would totally agree with this. There was no big problem. This is where I think it gets really important, right? Because the other reasons, right, besides that of, what canon was used when Jesus was around, why did, the Hebrews take those 7 out, etc., comes down to 2 things, right? One is authority and the other is doctrine, okay? So in those books, there are Catholic doctrines that are rejected. And if you take those books out, then you can say, well, that's not in the Bible. One perfect example of this is praying for the dead, praying to the saints, purgatory, right? The big linchpin of that is 2 Maccabees 12:45. And so there was the Maccabean revolt, Judas and Maccabees, they have this big battle, they win against all odds and everything, and they're going back, and some of their people had died, and they find out that they had these amulets to the false gods from the people that they defeated. I'm getting really reductive on this, but that's kind of like the story, right? So they're like, oh, they were kind of living in 2 worlds. They worshiped the true God, but they also kind of, took some of the stuff they shouldn't have taken. And so what they do is they send an offering money to the temple for offerings, for sacrifices to be made for these dead people, in hopes that would help them along their way in the afterlife. And so that means that at that point, and these are in the Dead Sea Scrolls, these are in, these books are there for a while, right? So then you see the germ of this doctrine of praying for the dead, and it is the opposite of, you're dead and it's done and you're in heaven. So is there some purging process? Is there this point where you die, as the Catholic Catechism of the Catholic Church says, you die in friendship with God, right? You're not in mortal sin. You haven't rejected Christ and everything, but you had such a affection and attachment to sin and the things of this world that you need to have that purged from you. We don't know time in heaven, right? So I understand that people have a problem with purgatory because they're like, why would there be like 100 years in purgatory, 1,000 years in purgatory? Even Pope Benedict said it, it could be kind of like what I learned in Protestantism is like, you stand before the judgment seat of Christ, everything, your life flashes before you, you're purged of all that stuff and you're in. We don't know that, right? So you can go both ways with that, but the fact is that, we have scriptural precedent here that we could pray that through, help them on their journey, and help them with that. So if you keep those 2 books in the Bible, then the Catholics now have an argument, and then they will do that with 1 Corinthians, like what I was just talking about. And so we can't have that, right? So Luther's coming in, the Reformation is coming in, they're trying to get sola fide, sola scriptura, sola Christo, and so these things that are having a problem with those doctrines, they have to get out. And, I remember learning in Lutheranism, that Luther had a problem with Hebrews and James. He called James a epistle of straw. Why? Because in James, it's saying that, so you see how we're not saved by faith alone, right? And he's got this big faith alone doctrine going on. And you can, we could talk about that on another episode or stuff like that. But you could see how new stuff is being created, and we have to remove anything that could contradict that. In fact, we have to remove all of history to contradict, to keep the contradictions from happening, right? And it's amazing for me, and I've said this before probably, how, people will hang their hat on and die on a hill for things, doctrines that were created in 1900, 1950, all the way over here, 1600, right? But then, be like, well, Irenaeus or Ignatius said this in 110, and people will be like, oh, error could happen already, like, okay, you really have to remove 2,000 years of history or 1,600 years of history to really get where you're going. And I'm not trying to be an apologist, and I'm not trying to go after the Protestants. This channel is turning into being my desire to help new Catholics, Catholic converts, people are going through OCIA, people have just gotten through OCIA, or people who have been Catholic for so long and never really dug deep into their faith. And so that's the only reason why I really want to give juxtapositions between Protestants and Catholics, is because that is my journey. And these are some things that you have been taught, and you have to unlearn and relearn and go, is that, we are at least going to come into these situations that nothing can mess with the sufficiency of Christ and Christ crucified. And so if you understand all these Catholic doctrines in light of that, you'll appreciate it and you won't be afraid of them anymore. And you'll understand that they're actually there to glorify Christ, not be like, oh, well, you're praying to Mary, so Jesus must not be enough. That's not why any of that stuff is around. Second thing, sorry, tangent. Second thing, there are some beautiful things in these 7 books of the Bible. And if you ever read them, you would be shocked, right? One of those is in the book of wisdom, and it's in chapter 2, verse 12, verses 20. And there is a prophecy of Christ that, Isaiah could go head to head with Isaiah, right? And how clear this is, right? So it says in there, let us wait for the righteous man, because he is inconvenient to us and opposes our action. He boasts that God is his father. Let us test him with insult and torture. Let us condemn him to a shameful death. And if you've read the Gospels, right? You know how much that tuned the Pharisees and the Sadducees up, right? Every time that Jesus proclaimed to be the Son of God, to be equal with the Father, that was all the blasphemy that they crucified him for. And this, and there's more to it. There's 8 more verses. If you really should read chapter 2 of the book of wisdom. You just read that and you're like, oh my goodness, it's prophesying the crucifixion and why the crucifixion is going to happen. And, I think that's just incredibly, incredibly beautiful. So that's why we have 73 books in the Bible. They're beautiful. I encourage you to read them. There's some great doctrines that have come out of that. Until the next one, I pray you are having a blessed summer. And in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I'll see you on the next one.